Good afternoon everyone, and thank you so much for joining my session here at Brighton SEO. Today I'm going to be talking about digital PR and why as an industry I think we need to check ourselves a little bit more when it comes to coming up with campaigns. Now in digital PR there is so much to it, so all the way from ideation to then validating an idea to creating the asset, whether it's an infographic or an interactive piece or a video, then to coming up with a pitch that represents the data and also sells it to a journalist, and everything else that comes in between. Essentially, we've got a really big job to do. So it's not surprising that occasionally corners are cut or we're not quite thinking about things as a bigger picture. So that's what this talk is gonna cover. But first, just to take you back, I started off in traditional PR. So a big part of my job was these four things here. So event publicity, brand guardianship and positioning, gaining coverage both on and offline, as well as crisis management. So when I moved over to digital PR, it came as a little bit of a surprise to me that my main goal was now to earn links. And in my opinion, this can be what causes a little bit of a problem sometimes. Not all the time, but occasionally it can, because when we do things with the sole purpose of gaining links, it can be really easy to forget about some of the core traditional PR values, like looking after a brand, like thinking about the ethical implication, and like thinking about data. But before I move any further, I want a big disclaimer here that I absolutely love links, and I personally believe that we should be using links as our KPI. So it's not an attack on links whatsoever. This isn't a debate about whether we go for links or coverage, but it's just a conversation about how much we need to consider these three key things when it comes to coming up with a campaign idea. So the three topics are data and methodology, ethical implications, and brand guardianship. Data and methodology. Spoiler alert, it's important. So let's kick off with point number one, data and methodology. We've all likely seen a campaign or worked on a campaign where the methodology is a little bit loose or there's no methodology at all. The data might not be from the most reliable source, or it could be completely made up entirely. And I think there's a few reasons why we need to have legitimate data and strong methodologies. And it's kind of broken down into three core reasons for me. So the first one is consumer trust. Now, media trust worldwide has dropped by 8% between 2020 and 2021. And I think we owe it to the public to be putting out correct information and interesting stories and data that isn't made up. And the second point is a relationship with journalists. Now, I think the easiest way to build a relationship with journalists is by sending them good content, link-worthy content, and making sure that their job is as easy as possible by providing them with all of the information they need, the entire story, all of the assets, and a strong methodology. But let's say that that doesn't happen. For whatever reason, the methodology is weak or the data is weak. Whose fault is it if that story still goes out? So I put out a quick poll on Twitter to find out whose responsibility it is to make sure that the data is correct and that the methodology makes sense. Now, as you can see, the majority said that's the PR's responsibility with 65%. A lot of people said both. The majority of people said both, which I think is a really fair point to make. Emma here said that she voted as a journalist, and if you're not going to check the source on your head, be it because your name goes on the piece. Harry here, who studied journalism, said that it was drilled into him at university that all quotes and data needed to be checked before publishing. So whilst the journalist is responsible, it's really important for the PR to send legitimate data and tight methodologies, because if they don't, the data from them is never going to be trusted again, and ultimately you'll ruin your relationship with a journalist. And the third thing we need to think about is digital PR as an industry. Now, Giselle makes a really good point here. So somebody commented saying that one of the pillars of the industry is made up surveys. It's common practice, everyone does it, always has been done. But she said that if that is the case, that we need to stop doing it, because digital PR is seen as an alternative to shady link building. And if we carry on doing things like this as an industry, it's not going to be long until Google updates their webmaster guidelines to include digital PR campaigns in the list of things of what not to do. So our digital PR expert for this section is Alex Cassidy from Honsho Search, who says that strong methodologies are the backbone of the work we do. Whether it's a reactive piece forged in an afternoon or a month-long planned study, an indefensible methodology is inexcusable. The best way to deliver both is to hire professional data analysts and to sense check it with somebody outside of the project. If the experts disagree and you can't explain it with a straight face, go back to the drawing board. So, 3 top tips based on this section. Number 1, make sure you're using reliable data and definitely don't ever make anything up that's going to a campaign. 2, make sure there's a data expert on the team. I'll put my hands up, I am the worst person in any team when it comes to data. It's not my strength, but it is for some other people. So make sure you've got a range of skill sets within the team, people who can find strong data, people who can understand it, and then those who know how to put it out to press. And then also to include your methodology and all of the links to sources to the journalist, both to cover your own back, but also to make sure that it's nice and easy for the journalist to use. Ethical impact. Think and then think again. So on to point number 2, ethical impact. And this is a pretty big topic and it's probably something I could have taken the whole 20 minutes discussing. But I think it's really important that we ask ourselves 3 key questions when it comes to ideation and coming up with different campaigns. So number 1 is, could it be harmful? So could the campaign be harmful to a group of people? Could it add to harmful stereotypes in any way, shape or form? Then how could it be spun? So it might not be your intention that the story is told in a certain way, but is there some data in there? Is there a kind of hint to a story where a negative angle could be taken and used? And then, is it inclusive? So are you talking to a wide enough group of people? Are you missing out key people within your audience? And it's not to say that you can't take risks, but within our job, we've got an ethical responsibility for the stories that we put out. So I want to show you an example here of a story that went out and did extremely well for the client that we worked on it with, and it gained hundreds of links and was deemed a huge success, but left me with a few thoughts. So this is the Modern Santa campaign. We surveyed people in America to find out how they would modernize Santa, and they came up with so many ideas ranging from tattoos to different ways that Santa could use technology to make his job easier, and there were also a few different points about gender in there as well. Now, it wasn't the story that we put out, but the story that was predominantly used was about the fact that Santa would be gender neutral. And it kind of had a little bit of a negative spin. There were a lot of use of the word that it was in debates and that people were outraged. There was a little bit of a snowflake mentality built around the stories. And I spoke to my friend who is part of the LGBTQ+ community, who actually shared the campaign at the time and was a little bit frustrated by it because he felt that when stories like this go viral, it adds to the narrative that people in the LGBTQ+ community care about stuff like this. We don't. We care about equal rights, representation, and safety. Stories like these dilute the real issues we face and the topics that should be covered by the media. Now, we didn't lead with the story. We didn't talk about gender within the pictures, but if the data's there to be found, then I personally think that it's still our responsibility to look at a little bit further, and it's something that I wish I thought about a little bit more at the time. But it's not just the story and it's not just the data that matters when it comes to these issues, because it can be the actual design and delivery as well. So I wanted to show you a good example of a piece about weddings, which it could have been really easy for a designer to take this and represent his own image of himself and his partner, and he didn't. He thought about it really carefully. He made sure this was inclusive, both when it comes to ethnicity, but also when it comes to gender and different sexualities here as well. And that's good from an ethical point of view, of course, but it's also good from a brand point of view, because you're then speaking to a wider audience of people and you're avoiding leaving certain groups of people out of the campaign, but also out of the product that you're trying to sell to. I asked Saffron to give a comment as our digital PR expert for this section because she's such a great voice within this space. And she said, I believe as PRs we have an opportunity to make real change in the media with the campaigns we create. There is a fundamental lack of diversity and inclusion within the existing UK media landscape, and we have an opportunity to be one of the key stakeholders which creates change. So the top 3 tips for this section are to hire diversely. The best way to make sure that your campaigns are representative to a wider group of people is to make sure those people are within your business, that they are coming up with the ideas, they are sense checking it and making sure that it's not harmful and that it is speaking to a wide group of people. A second point is to add these ethical questions into your validation phase. So whilst you're asking yourself, what kind of publications can we see this campaign in? Or where are we going to find the data? Or why is this interesting, for example? Also ask yourself, could this be harmful? How could this campaign be spun? And finally, representation matters. So whether it's within the data, if it's a survey, or whether it's within the design itself, make sure that you're including a wide range of people within the actual piece and not just representing yourself if you're the only person working on it. Brand guardianship is still important. So on to the third point, which is brand guardianship. And in digital PR, it's still important. So it's not a core part of our job, especially if you are working agency side, but I believe there are a few different reasons why we need to take it seriously when it comes to link building and digital PR. So the first point is client retention. Now, we are the experts when it comes to a client who don't work in the digital PR space, so it's really important for us to be very honest with the client and to make sure that they're aware of the limitations of the kind of content they should be putting out. So for example, if your client works in travel and they want to put a story about sustainability, but they are not a sustainable travel industry by any stretch of the imagination, it's really important to be transparent with them about the backlash that could come from that. And whilst you could put out a story that gets a backlash and creates a whole load of coverage and gets tons of links, it's important to think about the actual value of that link versus the damage it could do to the brand. So honesty and transparency with the client here is the message. And also talk about the authority of the brand. So what spaces can they talk in? What spaces do they have an authoritative voice? And what spaces do they need to stay out of? We see more than ever on events like Pride, for example, so many different companies speaking up when really they're not a big part of the conversation. And actually, unless your whole brand and all of your ethics line up with that positioning, it can actually cause more damage than good to speak out at those times because it comes across as disingenuous and a little bit insensitive. And remember that if you are working in an agency, you have been trusted with that brand. So if you want to keep that client on board, the best thing to do is to protect that client from backlash from the media. And please don't ever do things like this. It's something that you're taught in traditional PR, but in digital PR, these things don't come up so often. So here's an example of where a PR has emailed a journalist called Rob Price. In the subject line, they've put, "We're contacting you about suspicious activity on your account," which might seem just like a light-hearted subject line to get his attention, but actually when you look at compliance guides for businesses, it can get you in a hell of a lot of trouble. And again, it's our responsibility as the expert to think about the brand when you are acting for them. So the digital PR expert for this section is Beth Nunnington from Journey Further. And she says, with PR, it's really easy to get carried away and come up with an idea and outreach it without asking yourself why. Look for areas in your client's backlink profile where relevancy is missing and ideate around this theme or topic so that you can earn links within this space, which I think is a really valuable tip. And for 3 more top tips is act as a consultant. Make sure you're being really honest and realistic with your client so that they know the kind of campaigns that is worth putting out and the ones that might be worth holding back. Think of the worst case scenario at all times, and it's not to say that you wouldn't do a campaign where there is a risk, but make sure that you're aware of that risk and make sure you've already got a little bit of a backup plan of how you would deal with it if it did go slightly wrong. And make sure the brand is being authentic. So whoever you're working for, whether you're in-house or agency side, make sure that if your brand is talking about an issue like pride, for example, that you've got the kind of policy internally to back it up, and that there's no reason you're going to be called out for being unauthentic or disingenuous within that space. And to finish, all of these things are of course linked, because if you've got a good data source and a good methodology, then you're going to be ethical. If you don't, there's a chance you'll be unethical, which can of course cause problems for the brand. Which moves me on to ethical impact. So again, it's our ethical responsibility to create stories with strong data that won't damage or hurt marginalized groups of people. And then brand guardianship. If you're using poor data, and if you are damaging groups of people, or you're putting out stories that could potentially be upsetting, you're going to be damaging the brand at the same time. Now, sometimes there's a temptation within digital PR to create stories where you know you're going to get a ton of links that might be controversial, that might be clickbaity, or might even be using fake data, because then you can get the headline that you wanted. But it's really important that we avoid doing this. And I appreciate that building links can be really tricky, and hitting targets is always the kind of key thing, especially as agency workers. But we can't let our standards slip within an industry. So this talk isn't to point fingers at anyone. I know personally I've worked on campaigns that I wish I'd have thought about a little bit more, or potentially the data has been skewed ever so slightly, but we need to be able to hold each other accountable and have these conversations really openly so that we can improve as an entire industry. And that's for the sake of the media landscape as a whole, for the sake of the end reader and user, but also for our industry as well. Thank you so much for listening. I'm really looking forward to the Q&A shortly, and I'd be more than happy to chat about any of the topics or anything else on Twitter.